Imagine being outnumbered 2-1. Your army exhausted from weeks of marching. Your enemies closing in from all sides. And yet, you deliberately make yourself look weaker. Sounds mad, doesn't it? But that's exactly what Napoleon Bonaparte did in December 1805. And what happened next became one of the most brilliant military victories in history. This is the story of Austerlitz, the battle of the three emperors, where genius met ambition on a frozen battlefield. Main content. Let's rewind a bit. The year is 1805, and Europe is absolutely fed up with Napoleon. The chap had already won 2 major wars, carved up territories like a Sunday roast, and crowned himself Emperor of France. Now, he's eyeing the crown of Italy as well. You can imagine how that went down with the other European monarchs. Britain, already at war with France, was desperately trying to stop Napoleon, as naval forces from ferrying 200,000 troops across the Channel for an invasion. But the real drama was about to unfold on land, not sea. Everything kicked off properly when Napoleon did something spectacularly offensive, even by his standards. In March 1804, he sent dragoons into neutral Baden to kidnap the Duke of Enghien, a member of the old French royal family, and had him executed for treason. The royal courts across Europe were absolutely gobsmacked. This wasn't just breaking the rules. This was tearing up the rulebook and setting it on fire. Then Napoleon went ahead and crowned himself emperor. Not content with that, he added King of Italy to his collection of titles the following year. Essentially, he was telling the Austrian and Russian emperors that he considered himself their equal. That didn't go down well at all. So Sweden, Naples, Austria, and Russia all signed up with Britain to form what we call the Third Coalition. The numbers looked good for the Allies. They had Napoleon outnumbered nearly 2-1. Their plan seemed solid enough on paper. 90,000 Russian troops would march to the Prussian border to force Prussia into the alliance. Another 50,000 Russians under General Kutuzov would head into the Holy Roman Empire to link up with 120,000 Austrians. More Russians and Swedes would land in northern Germany, whilst another huge Austrian force would push into Italy. Brilliant plan, really. Except Napoleon wasn't the sort to sit around waiting to be crushed. The Allies fully expected him to dash off to Italy, as he'd done in previous wars. Instead, Napoleon pulled off something rather clever. He left 70,000 troops under Messina to defend southern France and Italy, kept 30,000 at Boulogne, and then, here's the brilliant bit, he marched 180,000 soldiers toward the Rhine at breakneck speed. Now, here's where things get interesting. Austrian General Mack had been ordered to defend along the river Inn and wait for Kutuzov's Russians to arrive. Sensible plan. But Mack decided he knew better and moved his base to instead, thinking he could defend the Black Forest region. Suddenly, he was 700 kilometers away from his Russian reinforcements. Some historians reckon there was a proper cock-up with the calendars. Austria used the Gregorian calendar, whilst Russia still used the older Julian one, creating a 12-day gap in their scheduling. Whether that's true or just a convenient excuse, Kutuzov definitely wasn't arriving anytime soon. Napoleon spotted the opportunity immediately. On the 26th of September, French troops crossed the Rhine. But here's the clever bit. He sent 2 corps close to the Black Forest to make Mack think he was coming straight at him from the front, whilst only 1 corps threatened from the north. The rest, they were moving at an absolutely cracking pace around Mack's position. By the 6th of October, Mack was completely cut off from his supply lines. The poor chap tried to break out 3 times, but Napoleon's forces were everywhere. By the 14th of October, the Austrian army was completely blockaded at Olem. A cavalry group managed to punch through the French lines, but were soon caught. On the 20th, when Mack received undeniable proof that Kutuzov was still weeks away, he surrendered. The result? Over 60,000 Austrians became prisoners, whilst the French had lost around 2,000 men. It was an absolute masterclass in military movement and strategy. Napoleon famously declared, "If I can't be in London in 15 days, I'll be in Vienna by mid-November." Guess what? He was spot on. French forces regrouped on the 26th and started marching east. When Kutuzov learned about Mack's disaster, he wisely decided to retreat and link up with another Russian army. Under Buk, the Allies fought several rearguard actions as they fell back, but they couldn't save Vienna. On the 12th of November, French troops occupied the Austrian capital, and Napoleon strutted in on the 5/10th, exactly as he'd predicted. But here's where Napoleon's situation became rather dodgy. Yes, he'd taken Vienna, but his forces were now scattered along the Danube to contain Austrian troops in Italy. He only had 53,000 soldiers and 157 guns with him. Meanwhile, Kutuzov had finally united with Buxtehude on the 20th of November, giving the Allies 90,000 troops and over 300 guns. Napoleon's men were absolutely knackered from constant marching and fighting. On the 23rd, he ordered a halt at Biarunin, in what's now the Czech Republic. Now, pay attention to what happens next, because this is where Napoleon's genius really shines. He needed to win a decisive battle, and quickly. He ordered nearby corps totaling 20,000 men to march to him, but simultaneously, he started making himself look weak. His troops abandoned the town of Austerlitz and, crucially, the Pratzen Heights, excellent high ground that any competent commander would fight to hold. He even tried opening negotiations with Austrian Emperor Francis and Russian Tsar Alexander. The young Tsar Alexander, watching the French retreat and abandon strong positions, concluded that Napoleon was in serious trouble. Kutuzov, who was technically in overall command of the Allied army, smelled a rat and advised caution. But he was overruled by the younger, more aggressive officers who thought they had Napoleon on the ropes. Classic mistake. The Battle of Austerlitz kicked off on the 2nd of December, 1805. Napoleon had deliberately weakened his right flank, his bait, whilst hiding his strength in the center and left. He'd calculated, correctly, that the Allies would stretch their forces to attack his right from multiple directions. At 7 in the morning, the Allied forces took the bait and attacked the French right. They pushed the French back from the village of Tunitz. More Allied columns joined the attack, and the fighting intensified around Sokolnitz Castle. Just when things looked dicey, part of Marshal Davout's corps arrived and helped retake town. The Allies still had a 2-to-1 advantage on this flank and drove the French back again. But here's the thing. Whilst all this was happening, the Allies were draining troops away from their center. Napoleon was watching and waiting like a chess master who's already seen checkmate 3 moves ahead. The Allied right flank also attacked the French left, hoping to pin it down so they could crush the French right completely. By 8 in the morning, the sun finally burned through the fog covering the Pratzen Heights, and Napoleon could see that only Kutuzov and his 4th column remained there. The bulk of the Allied center was marching away to join the attacks elsewhere. Tsar Alexander, thinking he was winning, ordered this column forward as well, to attack the French right from the north. At 9 o'clock, Napoleon saw his moment. The Allied center was weak and exposed. He sent his powerful center forward in a massive attack. The Allies were absolutely stunned. The French seized the Pratzen Heights. Allied reinforcements rushed back to retake the position, but this weakened their right wing even further. Napoleon then committed his reserves, and the heights were taken again. A massive wedge had been driven between the Allied center and right. The Allies attempted a counterattack in the north, but it was stopped cold. The Allied right flank was forced to retreat. Russian guards tried desperately to drive the French from the heights, but the French left attacked them from the north, sending them packing as well. Orders to retreat east were sent to the Allied left wing, but they were either ignored or impossible to execute because French forces were attacking from the north. Russian troops attempted to escape across the Sekun Pond, which was covered in ice. French artillery bombardment shattered the ice, and thousands of Russian soldiers drowned in the freezing water. The battle was an absolute rout. 36,000 Allied soldiers were killed or captured. Napoleon lost just 9,000 men. His troops were too exhausted to pursue the fleeing enemy, which meant the war would continue. But the psychological impact was devastating. 3 emperors had been present at the battle: Napoleon of France, Francis of Austria, and Alexander of Russia. 2 of them left the field in disgrace. Closing. So what can we learn from Austria? Sometimes the boldest move is to look weak when you're actually preparing your strongest punch. Napoleon understood human psychology as well as military tactics. He knew that young, aggressive commanders would see what they wanted to see: a vulnerable enemy ripe for destruction. He gave them exactly that illusion, and they walked straight into his trap. The Battle of Austerlitz wasn't just a military victory. It was a masterpiece of deception, timing, and calculated risk. Napoleon had taken every disadvantage. His scattered forces, exhausted troops, and inferior numbers, and turned them into advantages by controlling when and where the battle would be fought. Austria would sue for peace shortly after, whilst Russia retreated to lick its wounds. But the war wasn't over. It would morph into the War of the Fourth Coalition, and Napoleon would continue his extraordinary run of victories, until, eventually, his luck ran out. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most brilliant battles, make sure to share it with anyone who loves military history. Drop a comment below telling us which battle you'd like us to cover next. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who looks defeated but is actually setting a trap. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never underestimate the power of a well-executed plan. Cheers.